So Tony and Boris may not look much like the 17th century monarch King James I, and as far as I know, they haven't claimed the divine right to rule, at least not in public. But there is one important way in which these modern prime ministers are all a bit like the Stuart monarchs. They have all sought to exercise the same kind of arbitrary discretionary powers that were exercised all those centuries ago. These powers have no place in the modern world, and legal scholarship can help understanding why that is the case and what can be done about it. Prior to the 17th century, English monarchs uncontroversially exercised arbitrary powers by virtue of their office without reference to Parliament. These prerogative powers included the power of life and death and more mundane powers like the power to impose taxes. And over time, these prerogative powers have become obsolete or have been taken away by courts and Parliament. But there is a residue of uncertain scope and ambiguous provenance. Today, of course, for the most part, these remaining powers aren't exercised by the monarch personally, but by ministers or on the advice of ministers. But they still differ from the run-of-the-mill decisions taken by ministers in that they aren't based on legislation, and that's important. Powers that are based on legislation have a democratic pedigree and usually at least are more precisely defined and more susceptible to control by the courts. And they conform, therefore, to our modern democratic foundations for the exercise of public power and the idea that public power should be controlled by the law. Nonetheless, governments keep on trying to invoke non-statutory powers, often precisely to avoid the limits imposed by legislation or to avoid the controls imposed by courts. And here are 5 modern examples. The first, in the Tampa case of 2001, the Federal Court of Australia, over vigorous dissent from the Chief Justice, upheld the power of the Commonwealth Government to intercept asylum seekers arriving by sea, detain them and remove them from the country, despite the existence of a detailed statutory regime governing the same subject matter and which provided better protections for the asylum seekers. Subsequently, the Commonwealth Government entered agreements with PNG and Nauru to detain asylum seekers and established regimes in which their claims for protection were reviewed by subcontractors rather than by public servants, escaping the protections offered by the courts. Third, during the GFC, ministers' views of that crisis underpinned cash handouts, attempting successfully to evade federal limits on Parliament's powers. Similarly, the school chaplain scheme rested on non-statutory contracts with chaplaincy providers, on the sketchy premise that as the monarch was a natural person, a human being, and the executive was like the monarch, they could enter contracts on pretty much any subject matter the government liked. And in the UK, key events in the recent Brexit saga rested on the prerogative powers, most recently the October prorogation of Parliament, which sought to escape the scrutiny of the Brexit deal in the Parliament. Now, I don't want you to think all non-statutory power, all prerogative power is bad. Parliament can't cover every eventuality in advance, and executive government needs the flexibility in some cases to respond to crises. But given that we like to see the authority of the state resting in some version of the consent of the people and their participation in democratic processes, non-statutory power is increasingly archaic and unprincipled, undemocratic and unaccountable. So how do we get rid of what's left? It's not a new problem, and indeed the story of the prerogative since the 17th century has been one of taming the prerogative bit by bit. Some elements have fallen away through the passage of time or change of circumstances. ScoMo does not have the Queen's prerogative right to all the unmarked swans in open waters, and the black swans of Perth are mighty relieved, I'm sure. Some elements have been overturned by the courts, including the power to sit in judgment over the King's subjects. Some elements have been overturned by legislation, the UK Bill of Rights. But much remains to provide a foundation for overreach by contemporary governments, despite attempts by the High Court to rein in these powers and to reject some of the analogies and the assertions made by government. Even the UK Supreme Court in the second Brexit case robustly insisted on the primacy of Parliament. But Parliament needs to continue to step up and exercise its powers to limit the non-statutory powers of the executive, to resist the temptation to supine acquiescence in what the government wants, to use its powers to regulate non-statutory powers. What then, in conclusion, is the role of legal scholars? I suggest that there are 3 key contributions: clarifying the historical record on which the prerogative rests, making normative arguments about the reasoning in past and likely future court cases, and seeking to have impact through that on the behaviour of governments and courts in the future. I got drawn into this field in 2001 at the height of the Tampa saga. 20 years has passed, much has been written, not much of it by me, despite my promises to the ARC. Other scholars have contributed much and have been much more insightful. But given the ongoing behaviour of governments over the last 20 years, I have no doubt there will still be much for me to do when one day I step back from my current role.